to first be spend most of this meeting talking about how to evaluate these projects as they come over the transom by April 1st. These action programs that are going to be proposed, some of them may be proposed by some of you or by members of other committees working with other groups, and we expect, of course, to have action programs submitted from the public at large, and we're really looking forward to that. We know, though, that they're going to be coming in at different levels of resolution, if we can say that, and some of them are going to be similar. Some of them, may be quite different. And so, what we want to be able to do as a working task force and as a group is to make sense of those and start sort of categorizing them. So that we can take a look at how they might help us reach the goal of net zero in different time spans. But the thing that every cross-cutting committee is going to be interested in is evaluating those in the terms in which they are looking at those actions. Now, ours is the legal advisory group, and so we have to develop some way of understanding how we're going to evaluate these projects in the terms of our of the topic area of our group, which is law and policy, and then also judge these projects and evaluate them as they are related to the larger goals that the task force has. And so we're going to need criteria for that. And we're going to need some way of understanding how we measure those things. Some of that will be pretty qualitative because it's in the legal and the policy, legal and the policy field. But there are things, as lawyers and as legal experts. Oh, I see Harry's smiling face, and I see mine too. So you should be able to open up your video screens if you want. And so. What that means is we need to start talking about sort of how we would evaluate things in terms of our own area of expertise, which is law and policy. And so things that strike me as being, sort of the obvious things, and there are going to be more that you're going to come up with too, are, making sure that these programs that are proposed, that they enjoy public confidence, that there is a proper route for public participation, that they're transparent, that they are efficient and effective as policy mechanisms and tools, that they're fair, that they're inclusive, and that they meet the objectives of justice and fair distribution. All of these kinds of things will be things that we're looking at. I kind of look at this in terms of, I've been talking to some people on the Science Advisory Committee. And if you think about the Science Advisory Committee, their charge would seem to be pretty obvious, right? The things they're going to be looking at are, are these ideas, technologies, tools, are these things that work as advertised? And if they do, what measure of success will they bring us? That is, what are they capable of delivering? And so you can imagine how that could be done in a scientific and a technological way. I kind of see our work as similar to that, except what we're looking at is if there is a proposal, maybe it's a change to the tax code, maybe it is some kind of a regulation, maybe it is some kind of a permitting structure. That we would look at that and we'd say, okay, can this work as advertised, right? Which would mean, is there a legal framework in place that would accommodate this kind of thing? Are there legal vulnerabilities to it? Would people be uncertain about whether it in fact, followed all the laws or these kinds of things, or would there be litigation around it? Is there a permitting process? If we're talking about a permit, is it something that could be plugged into something that exists, or would we have to build something new out? These projects are going to have environmental assessments. Many of them are going to need permitting. Many of them might have some kind of uncertain outcomes or be dependent on certain kinds of evidence and information. And could these projects then sail through, right, all of those legal hoops, or would there be vulnerabilities or barriers of some kind? And that's kind of what we're trying to figure out, is sort of, could this work as advertised, whatever it is. And then the second point is, if it does work as advertised, how much could it deliver? And we all know from working in policy that sometimes ideas that look really good on paper just don't work in real life because of some reason. So for instance, if people don't understand what the rules require, or if they're hard to understand or hard to articulate, people might not take advantage of whatever the legal ideas are. If there's not proper monitoring of some kinds of standards or regulations or permitting, sometimes there's a lot of slippage in that. If we're not able to enforce something, or if the way that the rule is articulated is very difficult to enforce, then you're going to have slippage there. So even though you might assume 100% compliance or 100% buy-in from a community, you might not get it, right? And so those are the things we're going to look at too, from, again, sort of a legal policy point of view. Is this something that could work? And if it does work, how much could it deliver, right? Assuming that there might be some slippage and that kind of thing. Do we have the resources in the state to make this system work? So we're going to be trying to articulate more detailed, more fine-grained criteria to help us answer those questions and other questions too. So with that in mind, I just want to say it's really exciting to start working on this, and we are also going to start moving into, and this will be in April, into not only how we evaluate these programs, but how we get involved with substantive committees early on. And I'm already hearing from some of you offline about that, and I've been worried about that, or at least concerned about it too, because once these ideas take off in the substantive committees, they're going to need not just scientists' help, lawyers' help, other people's help to say, hey, are you building this in a way that could work in real life in the legal structure, or that could deliver real benefit given the administrative resources that the state has, and so on. So my hope, and we're going and Lindsay's going to tell us a little bit more about this, but my hope is that starting in April, we individual members of this law committee will be having more interactions with the members of other of the sectoral committees. And so we sort of are able to spread our tentacles out a little bit in that way and know what other groups are doing. And then they can get advice and counsel also from us as that's appropriate. So with sort of laying that groundwork, we're going to have some presentations today, and then we're going to have a large period of time for us to talk among ourselves, which I think is going to be really fruitful. And so before we do any of that, let me entertain a motion to approve the minutes of our last meeting. Lindsay's been good enough to send those around, I think, this morning. Is there a motion to approve the minutes from last meeting? Tim, thank you very much, Professor Hardy. And Tokisha Collins-Wright, thank you for seconding. And all in favor, please say aye or raise your hand. Okay, I see lots of hands raised. Anybody against? Okay, very good then. All right, I will then turn it over. The motion carries and the minutes are approved. And Lindsay, I'll leave it to you to take us into the evaluative process overview.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Chairman, for that great introduction. So members, I'll lead you through a brief presentation. Let me share my screen with you first. I'll lead you through a brief presentation. As our chairman mentioned, today is really kicking off the advisory role of the legal advisory group, which is really exciting. I know on the sector committees, they just had their meetings and we're excited to dive into the action development. And for you all, it's really the opportunity to start engaging in the role through kicking off our evaluation process. But before we jump in, I just wanted to frame some desired outcomes from our discussion today, so you have in mind kind of where we're going to build on what our chairman just mentioned. So first, we want to understand the process that we'll go through to anticipate potential impacts of some hypothetical scenarios. And this is going to be called our consequence analysis. So we want to understand the consequences of choosing different alternatives in this process as we move forward. And then second, as Rob mentioned, we want to spend most of this meeting getting input from you all on the criteria that we'll use in this evaluation. So not only having you guys evaluate potential impacts through an analysis, but helping us build that analysis as well. And then lastly, I'll share some next steps on working through this analysis and also on the action development process that is going on. So we'll dive into next steps at the end of this meeting, but in the spirit of setting some desired outcomes, I just wanted to frame briefly for you all where we will be engaged in this process over the next month as our legal advisory group. So as it mentions on the left, in this late March meeting, we're going to begin developing what criteria is helpful to understand the potential impacts of different emission reduction scenarios. So we're going to take some big scenarios and understand their potential impacts. And so today the goal is that you all would better understand what this process looks like of providing analysis, and then again, having that discussion on evaluation criteria. And in mid-April, this is the portion where you all will cross over with the work of the sector committees. So we're going to organize, as we had in February, this one big all hands meeting. We're going to have some separate workshops in the meeting in April when we're bringing everyone back together. So we can kind of toss up all of the groups to provide feedback on select draft actions and cross-cutting themes that will really help the sector committees in developing comprehensive emission reduction actions. So again, the goal is to provide feedback to refine those action proposals. And then we're going to take the input that you all give us today and then in the next few weeks on evaluation criteria to send you a survey to complete an evaluation. So we're going to build on the criteria that we make today and actually send you a survey in mid-April to get your input on potential impacts to scenarios. So this will be where the rubber hits the road and we're actually doing the evaluation part is in late April. And so with that, we want to have an opportunity for some office hours once you all get this survey, knowing that the advisory group on its own doesn't reconvene for a few months. So we wanted to have a check-in at the end of April, just as an open forum for answering questions on how to complete the survey when we get to that point. Because today we want to focus on the criteria side. So that's where we're going next over the course of the next month. I know it's a lot coming up, so I'll frame it again for you at the end of this meeting. But for our discussion today, to begin our discussion, I just wanted to step back and revisit the vision from the executive order to get us all thinking about outcomes. What are we really working towards in this effort, and how do we evaluate against that? So our vision, as set forth in the executive order, is that Louisiana will reduce its emissions to limit the worst impacts of climate change, improve the welfare of our residents and environment, and maintain a position as world leader in energy industry, ag, forestry, and transportation. So this is the goal that was set forth in the executive order, but the governor also put forth these, alongside that vision, these emission reduction goals. So we have a near-term goal of a 26 to 28% reduction by 2025, an interim target, and then this final target. And this is our central math problem, but getting to these goals will require some degree of transformative change for Louisiana, right? These are going to be a heavy lift and will require change for us. So what else matters for Louisiana and how we attain those goals? And through this process, this slide will look familiar to most of you as we spent our first meeting as the legal advisory group, but our other advisory groups and committees and the task force in its December and January meetings, I believe, discussing fundamental objectives. This is what we've defined as what else matters to Louisiana and how we reach our goals. Yes, we need to meet these goals of reducing net emissions, but we also care about improving quality of life for our residents and communities, creating a more equitable society, managing short and long-term success, strengthening our economy and workforce, conserving natural resources and protecting the environment, and adapting to climate change, adapting to a changing climate. So you all, as advisory members will be evaluating potential scenarios for reducing our emissions in terms of how they impact our objectives. So we've established that this is what's really important to us. So everything that we're considering needs to be evaluated against these objectives. And just to reframe that, ultimately at this stage in our planning process, we're trying to understand what the future of Louisiana looks like under different scenarios for reducing emissions, both in terms of how those scenarios help us reach our emission reduction goals, but also how they impact the fundamental objectives that drive this process. But there are a lot of approaches and scenarios by which we can reduce our emissions. So to briefly revisit our structured decision making, this process is a way to systematically question, evaluate, understand, and communicate the impact of these different approaches based on what matters most to us, our fundamental objectives. So for the task force to make an informed decision about what actually makes it into our climate plan, they need to understand what are the consequences of each of these different approaches and scenarios as it relates to our objectives. And the advisory groups will play a central role in forecasting what consequences might occur when we choose different approaches to reducing emissions. And so we want to understand these potential impacts, and this is what we're going to start talking through today. So in this planning process, we want to understand potential impacts across a variety of approaches twice this year. So as you can see here, we're going to do a first round of analysis in this March to May timeline where we're starting today. And we'll do another round later on with some built-in actions underneath those strategies, really adding more detail. But since committees are still working on their actions and we're still sorting through some of those details, we'll hold off to do a deeper dive until we get to the summertime. And we're going to present these approaches, these scenarios to you through portfolios, which are basically, as you can tell, just a group of strategies that you'll be able to evaluate in these consequence analyses. So the portfolio is really just a way to group these high-level paths to emission reduction. And so today kicks off our first round where we're going to think about portfolios at this high level. What is this big picture view at the strategy level to understand our future? And so ultimately, this first round will help us understand impacts of objectives across a number of sample portfolios at this high level, which will inform conversations with the task force that happen this summer as they begin to understand implications and feedback of choosing different options, of choosing a different portfolio. And our goal is not to recommend a singular portfolio, but just to understand the impacts across them. And then in the second round, as I mentioned in the summer, we'll bring in that action development and refine with specific details of policies and programs being proposed in this process. So this first round is also kind of a dry run to get us ready for that second round. And so the goals of this first round, just to dive a little bit more into this, I think it's helpful to start with thinking about where we want to get at the end of this first analysis. We want to provide a structured way for you all as our advisory group members to weigh in on the important considerations in how Louisiana reduces our emissions and what are the anticipated impacts of different scenarios. So this is not a mechanism of replacing advisory group input, but a way to structure and a vehicle to formulate the input. So here's what we want to frame for the task force, a few big ideas. So first, what is the realistic limit of strategies towards reducing emissions? And I put an asterisk next to this since this isn't the work that our advisory groups will inform. This comes in a little bit later in the process when we have our updated greenhouse gas inventory and some more refined pathway tools to help us get to a clear number and a clear idea of what those emission reductions might look like. But below that in bold, these two components are what the advisory groups in this process will help frame the task force. So the potential impact of these hypothetical scenarios organized as portfolios will have on other fundamental objectives, and then what considerations are necessary to have positive outcomes for Louisiana's people and environment. So with those goals in mind, let's now talk about what we will evaluate. So we'll talk about how we do the evaluation next, but before we get to that, I just wanted to dive in a little bit more on what this first round looks like. So we will prepare and package multiple portfolios of strategies that represent intentionally hypothetical future scenarios for you all to evaluate in this first round. So to take a step back from this, as I mentioned, our committees have been working the past 2 weeks on refining their strategies, these high-level paths to emission reduction. And they're now working on this action development process that fits in underneath them. And we've talked about this a lot with all of our groups over the past few months, but that's where committees have taken a large role. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we'll focus now on evaluating these high-level strategies in the first round of evaluation. And our committees have developed a lot of different strategies and refined a lot of those strategies over the past few weeks. And so this is why we have portfolios, really just a way to group our strategies under a similar topic. So in this round, we'll intentionally frame extreme alternative approaches in these portfolios to see what happens if we just turn all the knobs on and see the maximum of what we can possibly do. So let's just walk through these two example scenarios before moving forward. So in this first portfolio, the group of strategies that represent a business as usual scenario, this would look like if we have a future where no strategies are implemented, what do the net emissions look like without changing course? And then how would this impact our fundamental objectives compared to how things are now? And having this business as usual case is really important to consider because things won't stay the same over the next 30 years, no matter what. So it's important to understand the consequences of inaction. And so in this instance, we're just turning the knob all the way up to see what is the maximum emission reduction from business as usual, and what is that maximum impact on our objectives. Similarly, if we move to this, another optional portfolio, and again, these are just draft options right now, we're still synthesizing the work of the committees, but another optional portfolio would be renewable energy and electrification. So if we turn this knob all the way up, what is the maximum amount of emission reductions that can be achieved if we pursue electrification and renewable to the fullest extent? And then again, what are the positive and negative impacts on our objectives, or the rest of our objectives, if we have a fully electrified future powered by renewables? And what must we consider in making this transition? So these are just two examples of hypothetical scenarios grouped together as portfolios, really bringing together those different strategies of the most that we can achieve. And so our team is working from what the committees have put together to frame about 3 to 6 of these portfolios of these hypothetical scenarios. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but the goal for the task force is not to pick one of these portfolios. We know no single portfolio scenario is exactly our solution, but rather this is an exercise to better understand the bigger picture implications of different approaches and begin setting priorities. So this will be working towards the summer discussions for the task force. And so before we move forward, I just want to see if there are any questions on the what, this portion of evaluation, and I'll continue on to talk about how we do evaluation, but just wanted to make sure this was clear to everyone. Okay, great. So moving on to how we're going to tackle this evaluation of those hypothetical scenarios. As I've mentioned a few times, we're ultimately going to evaluate against our fundamental objectives, framing the good and the bad of each hypothetical scenario. And this is a critical part of our transparent and data-driven process that the advisory groups would provide input on directly on how how different scenarios impact our fundamental objectives and what are the potential consequences for the task force in choosing these different scenarios. So these are the sets of objectives that we would like you all as the legal and policy group to evaluate. And we've selected these because we think collectively as a group, this is where your expertise is most significant for the process without spreading you all too thin. But I'll revisit this again later and we can discuss if there are any questions or additions around this. So we'll come back to this later on, but keeping in mind that we're evaluating against objectives. And so we're going to evaluate against our objectives through this survey to be sent out in mid-April, which I mentioned earlier, talking about what we're working towards over the next month. This is really just a way to capture your input on each of those hypothetical scenarios organized as portfolios. So the surveys will ask you all for a score of how each hypothetical scenario impacts each of our 16 objectives, as well as offering some space for a short narrative of considerations and key concerns. And the score here is not numerical, as I note on the right side. This would look like a scale from very positive to very negative in its impacts. It's really intended as a mechanism to systematically get and document your advisory input. So all advisory groups will be sent the exact same survey, but asked to evaluate different objectives. And in some places, there might be overlapping groups that evaluate objectives, but really having this survey as the way to put that, put your input in one place. So as we design the survey between now and mid-April, one of the key things will be developing consistent evaluation criteria for each objective that's used across every person who does this evaluation on an advisory group to use as guidance in filling out the survey. So there will be a unique scale for each of the 16 fundamental objectives to identify what specific relative benchmarks can help to understand what are the impacts to that objective. So let's take this example on the screen here. So taking the example of maximizing preservation of natural resources and ecosystem services. So this is one of the objectives, I think actually one that you all as the legal group will evaluate. But this is just some sample criteria that might be able to fit under this objective. Again, scoring on that very negative to very positive scale, not numerical, but just the rating of negative and positive. So if we look at this criteria, you see that across the criteria, we're trying to understand the large increases to or large losses in one or more of the following criteria. So this might look like overall net productivity of fisheries, acreage of wetlands and other ecosystems that mitigate storm impacts, or acreage of natural areas for birding, hunting, camping, and other outdoor activities. So I recognize that this is not a comprehensive criteria for this objective, but just an example of what we're after to help standardize each of these objectives. We want to look at the same criteria as we're trying to score each objective. So we want you all to help, as our chairman mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, not just in doing the evaluation part, but really in helping us build this evaluation survey as well. So we want you all to help identify these key considerations that others might not be aware of in considering outcomes. And we'll get our feet wet with this today and really allow you guys to have about 2 weeks to continue thinking through what criteria might look like across all of the objectives. We'll take a few today and then allow you all to dive into that moving forward. But to put all of the pieces together, we'll synthesize all of your input on the evaluation criteria over the next few weeks to then send out this survey in mid-April. And you'll take those hypothetical scenarios organized as portfolios and run them through this evaluation criteria. So you'll take those 3 to 6 high-level portfolios with the strategies underneath them and begin to consider how does this impact each objective and going throughout the criteria. And as I mentioned earlier, another key piece is to provide bullets and short narratives summarizing your key concerns. You might find that filling out the survey, it's very challenging to score these high-level scenarios with these more detailed scales. And it might depend on implementation or depend on how strategies are implemented or worded or who is the lead on them. And it's really not a problem. There won't be a certain level of granularity that we can attain right now. And in some ways, this is our goal because, as I mentioned, we really want to allow the space to explain why. Why does it depend on implementation? Or why does this certain scenario raise a lot of concerns? Why did it score very negative or very positive? Or why is it neutral? So allowing that space to have more narrative responses around the survey. So moving to this slide, I realize that this is a lot of process information on the evaluation criteria and survey. So I'll just frame for you all what to expect as we move forward, and then I'll pause in case there are any questions on this process. So to frame for you guys, what we just walked through, in this meeting today, we'll have a discussion to begin building the evaluation criteria for one set of objectives that you will be asked to evaluate. And then after this call, having 2 weeks as a homework assignment to provide input on what criteria is informative for the other 16 fundamental objectives. So you'll have about 2 weeks to complete that. And then us as the planning team will have a week to synthesize all of the input that we've received from our advisory members and work with the chair of this advisory group and the other advisory groups to develop this survey to go out to you all in mid-April, probably in the teens of April, along with those hypothetical scenarios that will be organized as portfolios. In this way, you'll be able to provide a score. You'll be able to run through those hypothetical strategy portfolios and score them against the objectives and the criteria that is given, really as a standard way. So we're all looking at each objective with the same criteria and evaluating it in the same way. And again, providing input in short narratives of what should be considered for that objective and portfolio. And then the surveys will be due about a month later in the middle of May. So you'll have plenty of time to answer that and to work through the survey. As I mentioned, we'll have an office hour time at the end of April in case there are questions or big concerns around the survey once it is sent out. We'll be able to come back together and talk through that. And as I mentioned earlier, in that August and September timeline is when we'll come back and we'll do a second round of forecasting consequences, second round of this analysis with those more detailed options included. So I just want to stop here and see if there are any questions on this process. Yes, Karen.
I always forget to take off my audio. Thank you so much for that great presentation. That helped a lot organizing it. My question, I know you mentioned you would take questions at some point about the different criteria lenses through which the legal advisory group is assigned. And I didn't know if I could do that now. If I could, equity is a key consideration in law and policy, particularly surrounding climate. So I just wanted to flag that I think that's essential for us to incorporate and develop if we're going to be doing that this meeting. It would be key to have that in our jurisdiction, so to speak.
So Karen, these are the ones, you guys will be able to provide input on the evaluation criteria across every objective. These are the ones that you all will be evaluating, but I entirely agree. It might be very important to have the legal group evaluating through that equity lens.
Lindsay, could I follow up a little on that? So I guess what I'm thinking about is sort of inspired by Karen's comment, is there are pre-existing laws, right, that are involved with equity that might overlap with some of these things. So Title VI is something I'm thinking about, in which federal funds can't be used in ways that develop into, disproportionate outcomes based on race, for instance, or something like that. And then there's the executive order, which the federal agencies follow, which has similar criteria, and also that is that takes into consideration public participation by disadvantaged communities of different kinds. And so it seems to me that those would be very natural things, in fact, necessary things for us to take into account in looking at a permit structure, for instance, or in looking at something that would affect communities of color. So where would we be able to have in our list or in our lens the ability to look at those boxes, to, for instance, to say, does this look like a scenario that might result in disproportionate impacts based on race? Because if it does, that becomes a legal problem.
That's a great point to raise, and I think you guys would be great at evaluating creating a more equitable society group of objectives as well. Those are great points to raise. So as our chairman, if it's all right with you, we can add that one to the list of objectives for you to evaluate.
Well, I want to make sure that I mean, I've heard from Karen, but I'm wondering what others think about that as well.
Hi, this is Monique. I just wanted to thank Karen for starting this off and say that this is something we had discussed, and I thought we're in agreement on that equity would be front and center of the work we do, and achieving justice. So I don't hope that we don't have to reconsider that again on this. This is our second meeting, really.
And Monique, that's absolutely front and center in our effort. We have our equity advisory
I'm saying the legal advisory group among ourselves at our first meeting decided this would be part of our mission.
This is Tyler Gray with Lamoga. I mean, equity is an incredibly important part of the legal analysis. I think if we do end up going down a justice path, that it's really important that we frame that in a very articulate way to make sure that we are defining what that looks like. And I'm happy to participate in that conversation. I just think it has a broad application, and we want to make sure that we keep it within a scope that meets the goals that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think the goal should be justice and equity, right? Or else what are the laws for? I'm not quite sure what you think is outside of justice for the legal advisory group, Tyler. If you want to comment, I'd be interested in hearing that.
It really depends on, so one of the great opportunities that I have to participate in this, being a representative of industry, is that, there are conversations going on outside of Louisiana that involve lawsuits filed against members of my organization. And if justice is focused more on the equitable treatment of the community around them, that's fine. We just have to be careful about looking backwards at things that may have happened and try to find that there's some sort of responsibility there. That would be a challenge for me to participate. That's what I mean by trying to narrow the scope to what we're actually trying to achieve, as opposed to trying to pursue something that's beyond that.
Well, I think that the goal of this committee would be establishing parameters for equitable society moving forward. I guess I'm not quite sure. Are you saying that you don't, Tyler, that you're concerned that there might be legal liability on the part of some of the people you represent?
What I'm concerned about is having that discussion. And I think it's important, as we've discussed, that we want this to be a forward-looking group that looks into the future about how we, provide a recommendation to the state of Louisiana. And I think the more that we can have all of the stakeholders participate, I think it's important to talk about, that in a forward-looking manner. And that's what's most important.
Okay, I see.
As we have our conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So far, what I'm hearing so far from people who are talking is that it sounds like an equitable society goal, however defined, is something that we're interested in keeping within our jurisdiction. Am I hearing that right?
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to be clear that for me, I'm informed by the past and trying to figure out how we can use that to inform what we do now and in the future. So Tyler, I don't quite understand what you mean by not being informed by history in the course of this work. I'm not in agreement with that.
Well, what I'm hearing, Monique, thanks, is that there's a general interest in thinking about equity and keeping that within our purview, which would mean, as I see it, putting a check in that box on the second row. And I think that that after we sort of agree that that's what we want, then we have to return to this idea about what we mean by creating a more equitable society. And it sounds like, it sounds like that there's plenty to talk about there. But I agree with you, Monique. I think that at least it seemed to me that the impetus behind having an equitable society criterion for the task force was something that was informed by what's happened in the past and going forward in the future. In fact, if I can just borrow, from the Executive Order on Environmental Justice, which is going to be controlling a lot of the federal policy we interact with, that's exactly what that order is about. Is about redressing inequities of the past, in addition to avoiding new inequalities. But I don't think we have to go there to put the check in the box. I guess that's the point that I want to say right now, unless others have anything that they want to say.
I'll just say this, that we all know that we all come from very different perspectives for this joint work. And so as long as we're clear about at least some general shapes of the criteria, equity being central in that, I think that however we evaluate or what we bring to assessing that from our own various perspectives would be something we would all respect, or else we wouldn't be here. But I just don't want to be wedded to Tyler's group's definition of equity or justice. That's all. I'm fine for him to bring that in and weighing projects, but I just want to be clear.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Monique. Thank you for making that point.
And Professor Verchek, just to I want to make sure that we differentiate between equity and justice. And I think that you said it very well in your comments. There's a difference between equity, that we're trying to find solutions for the entire community, and legal liability, right? And I just want to separate those, because I think it'll be more productive to have that conversation around equity amongst all of our communities, and looking forward how to improve it and giving consideration for how that makes a better life for all of us. I just want to make sure that, I've had this conversation before, that there's more opportunity if we can avoid those conversations for going forward.
Could I just, I'd like to clarify a bit how I see law's role as key to this, and why we have to have equity front and center. I agree with Monique about that. And that is that, as we all know, many of the existing inequities are perpetuated by laws and policies. And the way that you prevent that from happening, when you have some role in weighing in on what law and policy should look like and evaluating it, is to identify how that could perpetuate, or perhaps even worse, exacerbate existing inequities. And so that's why Monique's point about looking at what is now, what has gone in the past, because many of the policies surrounding the energy economy have been key to creating existing inequities. And so if it's empowering in the sense that we have the opportunity to do lots of good things. But if we don't take those lessons from the past and think about crafting laws to take, hey, what worked, what didn't work, That's just what smart policymakers do. And I think how we would best serve the committee going forward in recommending what Louisiana should do going forward. So this is really, really important to leave out, because when it's left out, we will just perpetuate existing problems.
And members, I would just flag for you all that the Equity Advisory Group, which meets this Friday, they're further clarifying what this definition of equity in the context of evaluation should look like. So they started building that in their last meeting, but we'll further refine that, hopefully to provide some clarity on what does it mean to them as the Equity Advisory Group. How do we really evaluate equity, and what does that mean as you're going through these objectives? And they'll be taking, so today in this meeting, we'll take these managing for short and long-term success objectives, start breaking those down into some criteria. And on Friday, the equity group will take that group of the creating a more equitable society objectives, and they'll do the same thing with that set. But that doesn't negate you all from providing input on the criteria development and on evaluating that as well.
That's a good point, Lindsay. You know, because we really we should be informed, right? Obviously, by the equity committee too, which I think is a really good point. I had another question, and I don't mean to just we're getting the weeds so fast, but I would love to have a check mark in that box, as I've said before. I'm not pushing for another check mark, but I do want to sort of raise an issue, put an issue on the table, whatever. Is that I see that we don't have a checkbox for adapting to climate change, and I'm not arguing for a checkbox for a check everywhere. But it does seem to me that some of the things that we're talking about, many of them that are going to be coming up, are going to have some. They're going to have some challenges, or at least some concerns having to do with wetlands. And I'm going to pick two different examples that are sort of supported by different groups, just to make a point. But you know, carbon capture sequestration and the network of pipelines, that's something that's going to be in the wetlands. Those who like offshore wind, and I've talked positively about offshore wind, there's going to have to be a way to get the electricity onto the land, and that might involve drilling under the wetlands. And there are all kinds of other things too, and those involve wetlands permits, and they involve maybe environmental impact statements and all kinds of other legal things. And it would also involve risks, however large or small, to something that we're depending on to protect us against storms, which is how the adaptation part comes in. And so I guess I'm just wondering, what do we do with all of that? I mean, these things are going to come in, and it's not just going to be CCS, and it's not just going to be offshore wind. It's going to be lots of different, lots of different technologies and ideas, and they're all going to affect wetlands and the coast. And then Mark has his hand up, but I'll let you, Lindsay, police that. Nobody.
That's all you, Mark.
Go ahead and respond to Rob.
No, Rob, I think that's a great point to raise. I would love to hear from other members on input regarding this objective. Again, you'll be able to influence the criteria on all of these, but on that evaluation side, I'd love to hear what other members think.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to speak to. And I think that, and Lindsay and Harry, you know, from other conversations we've had, that I strongly believe that our ability to adapt depends a whole lot on the legal architecture that we have to do it with. And for example, if we're asking local governments, you know, parishes and municipalities and towns to participate in adapting to climate change and to playing the roles that Rob was just talking about possibly hosting or transitioning for, you know, the industries and such that may be coming in, if they don't have the authorities, and like if they don't have land use planning, they're not going to be able to do what they need to do. If they don't have the tax bases to handle the transitions, that's a law and policy question. It has nothing to do with what you're trying to do. It goes to, do you have the authority and the capacity to do what, you know, we're asking you to do? And so, I don't want us to handle all of the adaptation stuff, but quite frankly, a lot of the planning I see around climate change assumes that the legal authorities and the architecture for action are there, and I don't think you can presume it. And I would say the same thing, quite frankly, for equity. I think that we don't have to cover all of the equitable bases here, but law and equity are part of a joint system, in the way we handle things. So I think that we have to make sure that we're, recognizing where not only the discussions about equity need to happen, but where we understand where equitable remedies, how they can be articulated, how they can come to the table. So I agree that I would check, the equitable society and the climate change adapting to climate change box for things that this team is, one way or another, we're going to have to, involve ourselves in.
I see Nick's hand.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to echo what others have said about equity as well. I think, law is necessary to ensure that enforcement and implementation of any of these strategies or policies would be done with an eye toward improving those equity outcomes. So I think we're absolutely in a position as a legal advisory group to want to consider those things. And I think it would be great to, see what the equity group defines as far as, some of the objectives and how we look towards that. But I definitely am in support of adding a check to that second row. I think the way that we can weigh in is to say that this particular law or policy idea either is likely or unlikely to, lead to equitability, whether it's by, creating the, procedures to ensure that the policies are designed with frontline communities in mind, or, that they're included in the development process, or to ensure that these are actually implementable, clear, enforceable actions that will improve equity.
Karen?
Hi, thanks. I just also wanted to mention that I'm not just trying to check a bunch of boxes either, but I agree that both that adaptation in addition to equity, as I flagged. Additionally, I wanted to mention something to keep in mind is that the executive order that the Biden administration issued a week after taking office on tackling the climate crisis is basically taking a whole of government approach. So all the agencies, equity, justice is infused throughout that order, as well as adaptation considerations. So it's part of the legal framework in a way that goes even beyond the executive order that Rob mentioned. And if we want to ensure that Louisiana's plan is on track with what's coming at the federal level in terms of law and policy and the agencies to which Louisiana agencies have their authority for permitting and things like that, it's key for us to keep both of these on our radar screens and evaluating it. And there's plenty of guidance for doing that in myriad laws out there, as well as executive orders and other agency plans. Thanks.
And Mark, I would agree that those are important points to raise. And I have no problem if you all would like to add adapting to a changing climate to your list. It's just more homework for you guys in April, but if you don't mind, I'll pass it your way.
Thank you, Lindsay, very much. You didn't know you were opening it up to so much conversation during your question period.
No, that's great. You guys will be very informative in evaluating these. It's a great decision.
Folks, while we still have this time open, is there anyone else who wants to jump in or make a comment or ask a question?
Yeah, this is Takesha. I guess I just kind of want to reiterate what others have said, that I think definitely equity considerations is something that we kind of would be remiss if we're not taking care of that and and focusing in on that as part of the legal advisory review. I feel like a lot of the evaluations that happen, obviously, as attorneys, when we're doing, citing concerns and stuff like that, obviously, EJ and equity is a huge concern that we look at. And so it is the work that we do as part of our legal analysis. And I think it would just, again, be really remiss if we weren't paying attention to that and looking at that right now while we're doing this huge, while we're doing all this work right now to create this climate plan. As the legal folks, we should be looking at that as well. So, I mean, I pretty much agree with what everyone has said before me, and just, wanted to say that.
Thank you. Lindsay, I wanted to make a comment that I've already made to you yesterday, and I wanted to share it with folks. And that is that there's no perfect way to do any of this, but one of the, and I love multiple scenario planning and different kinds of scenario analysis. I think it's super helpful, particularly in these climate areas. One of the challenges in that field is there are always underlying assumptions. And the trick is I think you have to make assumptions, but the trick is always to understand that you're making assumptions and what they are. And so, for instance, if you were to look at a portfolio in which we went full throttle renewables, and we were going to talk about, I'll just use the example again of offshore wind. There are uncertainties in offshore wind, particularly in the Gulf, having to do with the effects of hurricanes and other issues too. The price, to what degree it becomes profitable to have offshore wind. And so if we were to look at a scenario in which we had a lot of that, we'd be having to think, well, am I assuming that the economics are going to work, or am I assuming they're not going to work? Am I assuming that we've got the technology for the hurricane, or am I assuming that we don't? Again, turning to carbon capture and storage, right? If you say, okay, here's the scenario or the portfolio in which we deal with CCS, we're going to be thinking, well, do I mean CCS if it works as advertised, or do I mean CCS if we actually can't do it after we tried really hard? Or do I mean CCS if it leaks, or if it doesn't leak? And so those are the kinds of things that in our discussions we are going to have in the back of our minds. And I don't quite know what to do about it, because we're not going to have a scenario in which it works, a scenario in which it doesn't work, and scenario in which it sort of works. But that's basically what reality is. And so in thinking about the legal structure, when I think about, I don't know, whether it's offshore wind, I'd be thinking about, well, okay, effects on endangered species. Maybe they can be controlled, maybe they can't be controlled. Maybe the permits can be streamlined, maybe they can't be streamlined. In carbon capture, well, maybe there are going to be accidents, and then there's going to be liability, and then what do we do about the liability? So I guess I'm not answering any of these questions, but except to say that it is going to be complicated, and I expect that these scenarios are going to have in them lots of assumptions that we're going to need to keep transparent. We need to be transparent about our assumptions, I guess is the point that I'm making.
Absolutely, Rob, those are great points to make. And as you were framing those different concerns, I was looking through our objectives and considering the places where you'd be able to run them through the objectives.
Good.
So if you're looking at a scenario with renewables and concerned about the durability of offshore wind because of hurricanes, when you're taking that scenario and running it against this maximized durability of strategies in an uncertain future, it might score a little bit lower, or might be neutral or negative. And you can then write out why, because this takes into account a lot of assumptions that offshore wind would be durable in the event of an environment we live in with lots of hurricanes. Or your other example of preservation, your other example of ecosystems, taking that maximized preservation of natural resources. One of those criteria or one of those scenarios might score lower on that preservation objective And then you could explain why. Well, this assumes that we're building out all of this, and it might have effects on the natural resources or ecosystem services. So as you take those scenarios and run them through the criteria, I think that will help to frame some of these assumptions. Again, putting a special focus on those narratives that you can write out why this is uncertain, or why this might depend on how it's implemented, or it might depend on the timeline that it's implemented on. Does that help at all?
I think so. And you know, it just dawned on me that it's at least helpful for me to think maybe in terms of uncertainty too. In other words, we could say, well, with this technology, there's an uncertainty about X. With this other technology, there's no uncertainty about X, but there's an uncertainty about Y or something. So at least we know, you know, when you say maximize, we can't know, but what we can say is, well, there's uncertainty about whether it will do what we think it will do. And that itself is information. Somebody else has a hand up and I missed it. Is it Karen?
Yeah, I did. Thanks. I just, that was something else actually I had a question about. So thank you, Professor Verchick, for mentioning it. In terms of the criteria, is there going to be any point in the process, Lindsay, in which we evaluate each policy option that are components of the scenario? So CCS, wind power, do a thorough evaluation of it in light of the objectives, the criteria to give life to the objectives. Because if we're just evaluating scenarios that are given to us with a mix of options, I think that sort of begs the questions, and there's a lot of assumptions into creating that portfolio, so to speak, before the components of the portfolio have been evaluated.
Right, absolutely. So again, just framing these two different analyses that we'll do, at this point, we are doing more of the high level scenario planning to understand these big picture views. And our goal isn't that the task force will pick one of these scenarios, because we know there's no magical scenario, which there was, but there isn't. But then in the second round is when we'll add in those detailed actions. So we'll have multiple portfolios, and what's going to be different in each of them are the actions. And so that allows for a more granular analysis of the impact of different actions. We know that we can't give you guys, let's say we have 100 different actions or 200 actions to evaluate against 16 objectives all in their own survey. That's unsurmountable for you guys and for us to analyze that. So putting them in these broader portfolios to really organize, and that second set will allow for more discussion and more refinement of those specific details. Does that help?
I think so. I just want to make sure we're able to think about possible new mixes if our evaluation of certain of those components indicate we should just explore other possibilities, which is part of what I see legal and policy advising is doing when you're forward looking. And it still doesn't seem like there's a space for that.
You're saying a space for visioning outside of?
Well, just so potentially, could we reach the goal, net zero, by the overarching objective with this other portfolio? Is that possible? Whereas if we're just given these portfolios that are already crafted, we don't have a sense to explore potential other possibilities in light of maybe a lot of drawbacks by one component of one portfolio. So could we achieve it this way? Say we're not given a portfolio without option A, which we conclude through an evaluation of it has a lot of negatives. Is there a way we could achieve our emission reduction goals by taking that out? Is there a portfolio available, or minimizing that?
So Karen, let me know if I'm framing this right. So if we're taking these strategies and we don't like one of them scores really badly in this first round, it will not be a priority as we move forward. So this is helping the task force prioritize what does move forward. And as I mentioned in that February all hands meeting, at some point we do have to start to set some priorities, and this will help inform that. So if strategy 1 just tanks on everything, then it won't move forward. So it's not all or nothing with these portfolios.
Okay, thanks, that does help.
Yeah.
I'm just scrolling up and down on my screen to see if anyone has any other comments. Otherwise, we might be ready, Lindsay, to the working session.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Those were great questions, great discussion.
Thank you, Lindsay, too, for putting all of this together and for fielding these challenging questions.
Of course, you guys are our legal group. That's what we expect from you all.
What else do you expect?
So, I just went over that one. So a few considerations before we switch over to our working session. When we're identifying criteria for each objective, I thought it would be helpful to think, what is a meaningful outcome of this objective? It can be quantitative, but it doesn't have to be. I think an outcome can be measured or evaluated, but we want to get in that mindset of outcomes. What is a meaningful outcome? And then as we're thinking through that scale of the very negative to very positive, what benchmarks, what would distinguish the negative from the positive? What does success or failure for this objective look like? Again, this can be quantitative or relative, but should help define these relative levels of the score. And then just to note, we want to ensure there's a clear relationship with the fundamental objective, and criteria don't need to be comprehensive. These will be distilled down probably to 4 or 5 important factors in guiding evaluation. And we want you all to help with identifying what is most important. So we want to pinpoint those key areas that are necessary in this criteria. And I just want to note for you that when the criteria and those scales go out for evaluation, there will be the opportunity to provide other input, again, through that narrative opening at the bottom. We don't want to shut anything out, but we don't want to develop these criteria that have 10 or 15 different benchmarks inside of them, because then it's challenging to think through which matters most. So having a more condensed and consistent scale will help to guide evaluation. And I just wanted to revisit this sample criteria that we talked through a little bit earlier that I ran through with you all. Again, this is not in final form, but hopefully we'll frame kind of what we want to start thinking about. So taking this objective of maximizing preservation of natural resources and ecosystem services, first, we can think about what is a meaningful outcome of this objective. And so a meaningful outcome could look like overall net productivity of fisheries. Another meaningful outcome would be acreage of wetlands that mitigate storm impacts. That's pretty important for Louisiana. Another one could be acreage of natural areas for outdoor activities. And then if we think about success or failure in this objective, that would look like, as we're very familiar with, a large increase or a large loss in one or more of those areas. So again, determining what that criteria looks like, and then what should the scale look like as well for that objective. So as I mentioned, as we're going into our discussion today, we're going to focus on these 4 fundamental objectives, because these are tricky objectives, and I think you all as the legal and policy group will help us to begin to think through these evaluation criteria. And so I'll read out the 4 objectives, and I'll actually stop screen sharing, and Allison DeJong from the Water Institute will live note take during our discussion. We started doing that with the sector committees in their working sessions and found it was really productive to be able to see what people are talking about as we go forward. But just to frame our 4 objectives, the first one is maximizing confidence of the public and stakeholders in the outcome of emission reduction strategies to increase support for implementation. Another is maximizing efficiency and effectiveness of emission reduction strategies. Another is maximizing timely implementation of emission reduction strategies and maximizing durability. So those factors of efficiency, effectiveness, timely implementation, and durability. And just to note, we'll start developing criteria for all 4 of these today. It's quite all right if we walk away with 10 indicators under one objective and just one under another. We have plenty of time to come back and revisit this, all of you to revisit this over the next 2 weeks. But this is really just an opportunity to get our feet wet and to start thinking through as a group what criteria could look like. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen sharing and let Allison share hers with you all.
Thank you.
All right, am I up? Am I live?
You are, Allison. Welcome.
Great. Nice to be with y'all today. So I've set up the 4 fundamental objectives that we'll talk about, and I have some bullets here for criteria that we can talk about as Lindsay laid out, and if we have thoughts on levels, which would be the positive, very positive, neutral, negative, very negative. If we have thoughts on that, you know, we can add that. But I think, as Lindsay said, the criteria are really what we're looking for. And if we have time to bucket them into levels, then let's do that. But yeah, these are our 4 to talk about.
And members, I would encourage you all to think, again, take that question of what outcomes would we look for with this objective? What is significant in looking at the outcomes? And we can go objective by objective, but over time, if you have ideas on others, that's quite all right. Karen, I see your hand raised.
Sorry, just one, could we go, didn't we agree to add equity and adaptation? Could we go ahead and add those?
We will be adding those. Today, we're just taking one set of objectives to start thinking through the criteria on, but you guys can provide input across all of the criteria over the next 2 weeks, but in our working session, wanted to take just a few that we can work through.
So this is kind of, am I understanding this right? This is like a pilot that we're doing here.
Mm-hmm.
The first assignment all together in the classroom, and then we're going on our own to do the others. Is that?
Yes.
Yep.
So Lindsay, so the first one thing that I think about with the first criteria, maximize confidence and learn long-term, I would say transparency and information sharing is key for all, but especially for the first one.
Yeah, is that transparency and information sharing on, you know, on behalf of someone or by someone in particular?
I think it would be, I would say, surely government is catalyst or sort of spearheader of the entire plan. I'd say industry, science, to the extent that nonprofits have a role here. I'd say information sharing across the board. Academia, what information are we using to inform our efforts that should be shared?
Mm-hmm.
To start with today. This one also makes me think of public engagement. So I'm curious what criteria you all think would be useful to consider from that public engagement, maximizing confidence of the public through engagement. Might that look like?
Education to start. Education for sure. And then not necessarily starting at an education standpoint where we believe it's a proper place, actually going out and finding out what community needs are.
So maybe a possible criteria around that could be the number of public engagement opportunities per year and updating the public on the implementation. How does that sound, Faye?
I think numbers important, but I also think we should put some weight on quality and quality over quantity. Quality of those public engagement events will be incredibly important. And then also understanding that communities are starting in different places. So that's something that we should keep in mind.
Mark, I see your hand raised. What are your thoughts?
For me, I think it's going to be important to give everybody the sense that this is actually very even-handed. We're not exempting anybody and we're not picking on anybody at this point. But if you're trying to reduce, you've got to put the options on the table. And I think too often in the past, the way our approaches were set up, predestined outcomes. So they preferenced or imposed, and I think if we're going to make this, something that they actually have confidence in, they need to know that it's being driven by, the need to achieve certain outcomes and, the need to, I think acknowledge, the full range of costs and benefits that go with those.
Mark, do you think that cost benefit analysis in itself would be part of that confidence?
I wouldn't do that yet. Partly because
Thank you. I don't want to do them. So
no. Well, first of all, that gets, we all have different definitions of cost.
Mm-hmm.
And the costs that an accountant uses or an economist uses are not the same one that you or I might use or a sociologist. No, I'm using it in the broader sense.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of how we would phrase this in the form of a criteria, like that links it back to, have we maximized confidence, right? Are we moving in a directional way? Just so that when y'all are trying to evaluate things against these kinds of objectives, and I think that's what Lindsay was getting at with the number and quality of public engagement opportunities. If we're it doesn't need to have a number, but I think if we can try and phrase these in the form of a direction, if we can look at that, I think that'll make it easier on your end to evaluate.
Well, the two things I think people will use as reference points is their experience with things like environmental impact statements and the like, where is there, was the scoping really scoping? Were the alternatives really comprehensive? And I think the other is where, for example, with waste reduction and like recycling and the like, the amount of emphasis that has been placed on, quote, the consumer end of recycling to manage waste as opposed to the waste production side, is completely out of whack with any possible effectiveness. And I think people lose confidence in those systems in part because they realize they're in many ways set up to fail. And I think we have to try to make sure that, because this can be hard, but it has to be clear it's not set up to fail.
That's a great point. And we can continue workshopping that too, but I do like that point.
My work here is done.
Thanks, Mark.
Rob, I see that your hand is also raised.
I'll let Susan go first because I've been talking. Go ahead, Susan.
Thank you. So going back up to information sharing, I think it's important in our criteria to consider the audience we're engaged with at whatever particular point we are in the process. I know we all know the environmental acronyms and also what, when we use the terminology for renewables, we're very aware of what those are. But in lots of situations, we're going to be starting from scratch where the audience doesn't even understand what we're talking about other than renewables. So I just want that, make sure we make that point.
Yeah, that's really great.
And to Susan, I think that point would go along with the under education where not every community starts at the same point. That to keep in mind in the same vein.
I was just going to add, just as a thought, that a lot of this work about defining transparency and participation has already been done in the environmental justice process. And so looking at maybe EPA's or other federal agencies' work on EJ. So for instance, I mean, we could use the phrase meaningfully engage in stakeholders, which is a phrase that comes out of the EJ work. And I'm just reading from it now, but involve those who are affected in the decision-making process so that future decisions may best serve the interests of the most vulnerable communities. I'd also make a call out to tribal consultation and engagement with indigenous peoples. So I'm not saying you should write all this down, but I'm just saying that if you look at the executive order, and more specifically, if you just look at, let's say, EPA's website,
Mhm.
and the principles of EJ, you'll find a lot of the words and phrases that I think would, as Mark says, suggest certain things to communities and instill some confidence.
Love a research task. It's great.
And on that note, I'm curious, from all of your legal lenses and from the policy lens, how do we maximize confidence of public and stakeholders? What would that look like in criteria from this group's perspective? Any legal or policy ways? I know this is kind of a tricky one to encompass.
I've got one suggestion, that is don't presume trust.
Hey, Mark,
Earn
Nick,
it.
go ahead, Nick.
I think having clear legal requirements for monitoring and reporting.
That's a great one. And possibly having a transparent and clear regulatory framework as well for implementation.
So I think this goes together with the transparency piece, but it's not totally encapsulated by the reference to transparency, that it's both about transparency as to what the government is doing, transparency as to what is required, but then, clarity for the regulated community, clarity for government actors to know what sort of monitoring and reporting they're required to do, and ensuring that that actually happens.
That's a great criteria, Nick, because it gives us a clear direction of being able to define those legal requirements for monitoring and reporting. Brandon, I see your hand also raised.
Yeah, and I guess I'm going to ask a somewhat simplistic question to kind of piggyback on what Nicholas just said about clarity from the regulatory perspective is, I guess trying to understand what the ultimate goal is from this. Is it going to be proposed legislation? Is it going to be executive orders that further these goals? Because I'm going to reiterate what I said in our initial meeting, that a lot of the discussion, particularly when we start talking about renewables and the existing utility industry, is going to be squarely within the commission's jurisdiction, and any legislation or executive orders that purport to stand in the place of that jurisdiction will not be legal. Just putting it bluntly.
And Brandon, again, just to frame in this conversation, considering all those criteria, I think that's a great example of a criteria to have that line of responsibility. Nick, do you have another comment?
Nicholas, your hand is still up. Did you have another thing to add?
I'll lower it, sorry.
Where's my-
Yes, Mark.
Kind of following on Brendan's point, I think that whatever we come up with, there has to be a pathway for implementation. I mean, and that may be legislation, it may be regulatory, it may be shifting jurisdictions around, or it may actually be coordinating with other vehicles. For example, whatever's coming out on the national level, we'll need to reference. Secondly, I think we have to keep our eyes on, what's happening in other decision-making communities that are using climate and carbon management as a factor. I'm thinking specifically in the financial sector. So I think we should be looking at what kind of disclosures are going to be required by the SEC of companies, because that's going to affect the investability for these various ideas. It's not going to be a single enforcement or implementation pathway. But I think we have to make sure that everything we say we're trying to do, to get to where we want, it's going to be hugely ambitious. And it's going to require things outside of our state and individual controls. So we're going to have to mesh with some other things. And we need to really be thinking in terms of how we engage with those. But I do think the idea, we shouldn't just be talking about, abstract options and, hoped for outcomes. I think we should be really trying to figure out what pieces will move us toward those. And that would, to me, that's where I lose confidence in a lot of things, and many people do, which is if it doesn't really look as though that there's a plan to go from talk to action and action to results, I don't think people will have the confidence we need.
And Mark, I'm going to put a pin in what you're saying and bring that back when we talk about maximizing timely implementation. That's an incredibly important comment and objective that you all can inform. Nick, I see your hand raised. Do you have another point to raise on this one?
Yeah, and maybe this can go under one of the other categories there, but just in line with what Mark was saying, to put that in terms of what we can evaluate is to say that, as we look at any particular set of strategies or any particular proposal, do we think as a legal advisory group that this has a viable pathway for implementation? I don't know if that is always going to have a numerical value, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, how likely or how viable is that pathway? But we can at least qualitatively say either this does have a pathway for implementation or it doesn't. Is this something that we think would improve the public's confidence that something is actually going to happen or not?
And that last point is very central to this objective.
I think it is a criterion around which we can say that, but that also fits underneath the next one, maximizing efficiency and effectiveness, sort of the same point.
And with that, members, maybe we can transition to this next objective of maximizing efficiency and effectiveness. Especially from the legal and policy lens, I think this is a tricky one to navigate, and I'm curious what ideas you all have on how directionally we can think through outcomes of criteria.
I do have one to add here to start with this, which is looking for consistency with existing state and federal and local policies and laws, however we want to phrase that.
So something that fits into an existing framework rather than would need to be invented wholesale.
I think that's a criterion to look at. That doesn't mean that everything has to fit in with that, but it's one way of looking toward efficiency and effectiveness.
Yeah.
Mark, what are your thoughts?
I would just want to echo that. I think we often see that we have, lines of authority that we either don't use or we don't use the way we're going to need to. But you don't have to go back and reinvent things. I think a good example is kind of like what we see going on with groundwater right now, which is in Baton Rouge, which for years you had a regulatory agency that didn't think it was a regulatory agency. And now it's coming to the conclusion that, my gosh, there's another way to read those laws, and other people are reading them that way. So I do think, kind of seeing what our legal architecture is, so we know how to use it, and if we need to change it, we know what we're changing.
From an effectiveness standpoint, I would think, how robust is the monitoring and reporting requirements? And I think some of this might have been mentioned in the one above, but I think that's important for effectiveness as well, to make sure that you're measuring, at a regular interval or continuous interval in order to understand effectiveness.
That can increase public and stakeholder confidence as well as maximize efficiency. That's a great one. Monique and Rob, I see both of your hands raised. What are your ideas?
Go ahead, Monique.
All right, thank you for that, Professor Verchick. I would like to look to the Louisiana Legislative Auditors reports on regulatory agencies like the DEQ in terms of how we could think through strategies, what's not working, and how can ideas that are put forward through the task force not fall into the same minefields, or try to work to avoid or resolve some of that.
Monique, how do you think we could frame that? I'm trying to think how we could frame that as a criteria.
Or
as something we would want to be sure that we evaluate these scenarios again.
Well, I guess it would be to refer to those reports to identify areas where efficiencies and effectiveness are achievable.
So ensuring efficiency and effectiveness in state agency implementation.
That's a mile longer than what I was suggesting.
The hefty task. Monique, is that a good starting place, or do you have other?
I guess just as Mark was saying, let's understand the legal frameworks that are relevant to this work of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. What's the state of play, and how do all these parts move? I think it's also important to look at those Louisiana Legislative Audit reports about the state of the regulatory agencies with regards to meeting some of the objectives or the projects that would come out through this process.
So Allison, we can probably add that under understanding the current legal architecture. I think that's great.
Well, I guess the part of the maximizing would be to know the areas where there's inefficiencies and ineffectiveness that can be addressed through strategies, or yeah, I'll just leave it at address.
So possibly a criteria could be its ability to address those inefficiencies in state government. Thank you for raising that, Monique. Rob, what are your thoughts? Monique, do you have any other ideas?
My thought was that often when policymakers are saying, looking at how to make something work, there are a number of things that categories of things they look at. So one category is, have you chosen the right level of government, right? Sometimes you want the level of government that's closest to the implementation. Sometimes you want it higher up, so that there's just choices there that you'd want to ask yourself. Should this be done at the parish level? Should it be done at the state level? Whatever. Another is your actual sector, right? Is it make sense for the private sector to have a role, or is this a public sector thing, or is this even something that a nonprofit sector that idea. That's one set, sort of identifying the actor. The other is thinking about whether you want overlapping jurisdictions or not. Sometimes overlapping jurisdictions make sure the work gets done if one jurisdiction is messing around. Sometimes nobody feels accountability. That's the other side of overlapping objectives or overlapping jurisdictions. But that's another thought to consider. And then my last is related to something that Nick brought up, which is you want to know what resources are out there already and make sure that you're built in to plug and play. So if there's money available at the federal level, you want to make sure that you've got a system that is respected by the grantors there. If you're interested in knowing about disadvantaged communities, you might make sure that your criteria are the same criteria that are used in EJ Screen, which is EPA's environmental justice mapping tool. Or you might want to make sure that you understand how the social vulnerability index at CDC, how are they giving their information out so that you're prepared to accept the information into your decision-making model in the terms that the information is actually being made available, so that you don't have to make up your own information or your own system. And the same with the Department of Energy's got all kinds of technology and information available. And so you just want to make sure that you're using the same units, the same measures, the same jurisdictions, whether it's census tracts or whatever, so that everything kind of works together.
The first point you mentioned, Rob, around accountability, I think that is an important component to include under that first one of maximizing confidence of public stakeholders. It was one of the, Allison, if you wouldn't mind scrolling up, it was one of the criteria that Nick mentioned at the bottom. Oh, on pathway for implementation. Yep. Possibly another consideration is accountability measures are incorporated in that implementation plan or in that framework. And similarly, as you mentioned, Rob, that we're using similar measures and frameworks that ensure effective and timely implementation.
Yeah, good point.
Harry, what are your thoughts?
This kind of builds off of Professor Verchik's point, but where there are overlapping jurisdictions, or maybe not overlapping, but kind of consecutive, concurrent, where you need to have multiple agencies weighing in on a certain project, that the agencies are aware that and are coordinating with each other. So the degree to which there is ongoing coordination and on permit evaluations. And that could go to efficiency. It could also go potentially to timeliness in the next one.
A great consideration. Maybe leads us well into that next objective of maximizing timely implementation. I do think there is some connectivity across all of these, but focusing on the timely implementation objective, what criteria would be helpful in determining a positive or negative direction in this objective?
I don't want to be too cheeky about it, but I think it has to be before 2030. It'd be good.
No, that's a great point. Yeah, Harry, did you?
I'd offer, I haven't quite formulated it, but the degree to which there is a strategic plan already laid out. And so, because timely doesn't necessarily mean the soonest to be implemented, it just needs to be timely, right? And if there are multiple steps that you need to take first, to kind of take those steps first, and then in order to allow for further steps in a different direction or with a different strategy, perhaps.
Monique's first point, I think a way that we could frame that as a criteria would be the percentage of overall emissions, net emissions that occur through the strategy's implementation in its first 5 years of implementation. Maybe. So what is the effectiveness of that timely implementation?
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay.
I have what is maybe not so much an addition, but a gloss on that, and that is that the the underside of timely implementation is process and planning. And I can see in so many of these examples where process and planning is going to be perhaps at odds with doing things quickly. And sometimes some people are going to want to do things quickly and not worry about the process and planning, and other times it's going to be the opposite. And I don't know, we're going to have to confront that continually, because we know we need to do things fast, and at the same time we know we can't bulldoze. So I'll just raise that. Karen, though, is going to put that into a pithy answer.
No, I've got something that we'll need somebody else to put into something. Another, so it's related in the sense that I'm trying to articulate this, to not sacrifice being vigilant about what we learn on the ground or the consequences of strategies that are implemented, because particularly with the climate crisis, we're going to be thinking about doing things on a scale that haven't been done before. So ensuring there's some resiliency in an iterative process built in, that we can continue to improve strategies over time, and perhaps have room for rethinking things in time, to do things in a smarter way, because there's no way not to make some mistakes. And you don't want to, because you have this timeline, continue to make those mistakes at a critical time when perhaps things could be reevaluated. So just some sort of resiliency or iterative process built into what we learn as things are implemented.
I just want to underline that, because I think that is such an important thing. This idea that, and I underline it because in government and in other human institutions, we don't like to evaluate things we've already done, because we think it costs too much money and we might be embarrassed about what we find. But evaluating is so important, because you have to say, we assume this would work. Did it actually work? And if it didn't, then we got to go back and work it. So it has to be made iterative and flexible. I mean, we've got to build in a learning process. And I think I'm so glad, Karen, you brought that up.
Robin, Karen, that works well under that fourth objective too, of maximizing durability of emission reduction strategies. So possibly we could frame it as flexibility to address potential changes in law or in technology and cost effectiveness.
Well, and Lindsay, the last part of that is, I got to read it now. Yeah, when you say maximize durability, the last part of that sentence is in an uncertain future. And what that means, right, is that as time goes on, some things that were uncertain will become known.
Mm-hmm.
And to know those things, we have to be able to put that new knowledge into the plan.
Karen, did you have a comment on that as well? Oh, you're on mute.
I always forget. I just wanted to mention, I don't know if you saw, Faye in the chat had a really good term, some form of adaptive management is what Faye had in the chat, which is really good, pithy way of capturing. And I just also wanted to echo Rob's point, because he teased out some of my concerns about what we're about learning on the ground, is that climate science is moving really rapidly right now. And so it could be that goals are going to shift too. And so that's why this flexibility and adaptive management is so key to any kind of success, and making sure that timeliness isn't sacrificed. So not only are we going to employ technologies on a scale we never have and learn about the consequences of that and perhaps need to adapt, we're also going to have to adapt to all the changes that we know are already baked into the climate, but have yet to reveal themselves through the climate science. So it's essential that policy, as it's implemented, is well informed by has a way of integrating the science and assuring that there's a way to adapt in light of that.
I think ability to integrate to new science and data effectively is a significant.
Trying to synthesize, but if I don't synthesize in the way that you prefer, please let me know and I'll change it.
Got the hardest job.
You know, Rob, you mentioned in one of these other ones, policy design considerations when we were talking about efficiency and effectiveness, but I think there's probably policy design considerations on timeliness and durability as well. I'm wondering if we can dig into some of those.
Well, I think, you know, I hate to say it because it sounds so anticlimactic, but I think many of them are the same, right? But it's just making sure that you have the right actors involved, and that they know that there's somebody responsible for evaluating, that there's somebody responsible for getting the new science integrated, that there's a pause built in so that people can bring in new information before they go forward. And you know what, I guess I'll say another thing here, which is it's a really hard thing. You all know this because you work in government, but building the catwalks is really, really hard, right? Because the enemy of all of this is siloed decision making. And we're having a hard time doing that among our own committees here, right? But this is going to be really important, that science doesn't get siloed and that the implementers don't get siloed.
How about a criteria under here to encompass that could look like incorporation of strategies that coordinate across public and private sectors?
Yeah, that's
or having that coordinate.
Yeah.
Sorry, what was that, Lindsay?
So something like incorporation of strategies that coordinate across public and private sectors.
Do you think that's a timeliness or a durability criteria?
Again, I think it could be both, but let's put it under durability. Yes, Nick.
Yeah, thanks. If I could say something on durability, I think that a tricky part of this is addressing the point that we've discussed earlier about our role in assessing whether there are legal vulnerabilities. You don't necessarily want to point out what all the legal vulnerabilities are of things you want to do. And so I don't know quite how to encapsulate that kind of review, but certainly that is a key piece of durability. If we think as a legal advisory group that there is legal support for doing something, great. If we think there's not a lot of legal support in the current legal framework for taking a particular action, that's a relevant consideration. But again, I mean, I think it's a little tricky to do that. And you don't want to be necessarily pointing out the vulnerabilities, but rather just taking a frank look at whether, is there support and precedent for the strategies? Is this consistent with the existing legal framework.
And Nick, I was going to ask if there are other legal vulnerabilities that you see aside from support and precedent. Are there other things that would flag for you needing to understand and reveal?
Well, I think there's a host of them. I mean, is this the kind of action that can be taken by, is this sort of administrative action? Does this require the governor's involvement? Does this require the legislature? Is this something that a local government can do on its own? Is this something they can't without the legislature's support? Is this something that the state can do with or without federal support? Is this something that requires federal approval? Does it require federal funding? Is it preempted by existing federal plans or programs? And then there's process-based legal vulnerabilities. Is this going to require NEPA review? Is this going to, require consultation for its impacts on endangered species? Are there going to be other kinds of administrative procedures required either by state or federal requirements? I mean, all of this goes into whether it's durable as well as how implemented it is in a short time frame. But again, I don't know how to quantitatively or qualitatively evaluate these. I think it's complicated to know exactly what our role is. Some of this is up to the governor's team to decide, and the attorney general, to some extent, to decide what they think is or is not implementable at the state level. But I think it's relevant for us to consider. It's within our expertise to weigh in on these matters.
Absolutely. And possibly all of this could be framed as presence of legal vulnerabilities. Allison, you might have other ideas, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is durability, but it's also timeliness, right? If something's going to be stuck in a review for 10 years, then it's, does that timeliness match up with the proposed timeline, or does this plan or this portfolio assume that, that this is implementable before, reviews or administrative procedures that you would see coming down the pike, something like that. I think it's more along the lines of, are the anticipated administrative, legislative, et cetera, type hurdles accounted for in the plan, in the strategy's timeline and execution, right? Like, it's almost like a reality check, I think, is how, if it were me, that would be how I would want to evaluate it.
Monique, I saw your hand up, and then Mark and Professor Verchick after.
Yeah, I was just thinking that one criteria for durability could be establishing with the extent to which it's possible or practicable, establishing with the reduction strategy individual rights to enforce or secure it.
This may be because I'm not a lawyer, but can you elaborate on that for me, Monique?
Sure. So let's say we have a reduction strategy that's part of a permit requirement. Making it, including in that, legislation that would allow individuals to enforce that right in court, for example. And that would also, I think, just looking kind of expansively at this, is the extent to which there are benefits from these reduction strategies, considering ways in which that can be turned into or established as individual rights to those benefits or protections and reductions.
Okay, I think I've got that.
Mark, what are your thoughts?
I'm sorry. It's not establishing a reduction strategy of individual rights, but it's that paired with the reduction strategy should be considering ways in which individual rights can be made part of them in order to enforce or secure the benefits of them.
Good points.
I think I got that.
I just wanted to go back to the timeliness thing and really emphasize that we should be trying to forecast what the legal or policy uncertainties are. If we wait until an issue is red hot, we're not going to be able to solve it very well. I think that, we have to anticipate some of this and think in terms of what is the best way of getting additional certainty. Legislation is not by any means always the best way. Litigation is not always the best way, but you have to know what those are. So I do think for all of the, and one of the questions that, sort of came up when in our first all hands meeting was we were looking at all kinds of new pipeline-y things or new, re-envisioning what a grid structure is going to look like. I have no idea if all this stuff is common carrier. I have no idea who regulates it. I have no idea who has, expropriation power or eminent domain power. But those are questions that are going to come up. And also it will come up if we're going to be giving up oil and gas pipelines, what happens to those right-of-ways? We went through this with rails, with railroads, turning into rails to trails or not. But I just think that we should be, as we go, keeping a list of the things that need to be looked into, and then figure out, how we, create a pathway toward resolution or, getting greater clarity.
Mark, on this survey, this is too where, again, we'll evaluate this first time at a much higher level, but this is too where we'll invite the narratives more to explain where those uncertainties or anticipated impacts should be considered.
Right. And again, think of this as if you were, building a shopping center. You wouldn't build if you were uncertain about zoning. You'd make sure you understood zoning. You wouldn't assume that financing would be available. You make sure that you knew a pathway to financing. You wouldn't assume that your neighbors don't have rights. You check those out. That's all I'm talking about here is really, thinking through, those questions that we don't currently have answers to, but somebody's going to have to get them.
Yeah, and I think if during the evaluation structure, you as the legal advisory group can flag those things, that's going to help design better actions, right? That'll inform the action development process if those gaps are identified through this structure. So that'll be really important to flag those kinds of gaps that you see in the hypothetical portfolios.
I just wanted to add somewhere in there, I'm not sure exactly where it fits, it's related, is tort liabilities. And we know that companies are already thinking about this. The companies behind CSS are already anticipating tort lawsuits, and so they're pushing for immunity. In certain, at the national level, this is one of the things. And so we just have to. And the same thing is going to be true of the eminent domain, which Mark points out. There are going to be people that say, I don't want the pipelines, and there are going to be people that say, I don't want more transmission towers, and people who say, I don't want this or that. And then we're going to have to think about, well, what do we do? Do we just bulldoze through, right? Which we do for pipelines through eminent domain power, or do we immunize people from tort lawsuit because we think it's important enough to have? Or do we say, as Monique says, that there are individual rights, at stake, and that people have the right to secure their rights?
Citing on new infrastructure is a great point to raise. Thanks, Rob. So I hope this exercise starts to get all of us in the right brain space of considering some of these evaluation criteria. So Allison and I will take this list and try and workshop some more cohesive and try and bring together some of these points that you all made into criteria. So we'll share this notes document with you, but also maybe some ideas of tighter criteria that could be used to evaluate these objectives. But with that, as we talked through earlier, I encourage you all to keep working on and think through criteria that could be used to evaluate all of the other objectives, particularly through the legal and policy lens that you all have. It will be very helpful in thinking and wordsmithing those criteria. So if there are no further thoughts for now on this list, possibly we can move on. What do you think, Chairman?
I think it looks like a good list. I think we should move on unless there's anybody who has a comment or a question they haven't been able to make. Oh, there we go.
All right, awesome. And just, I wanted to remind you all that, you know, a lot of these fundamental objectives are meant to, like, there's not going to be a strategy that hits all of them, right? Like, they're meant to conflict. And so even these criteria, you know, they might not all be rowing in the same direction. They might show different ways in which you can evaluate things, even between these fundamental objectives, differently. So I think this is a great start. But I think some of the differences that are in approach that have been highlighted is a really helpful way of, you know, I think it's all useful. So I just didn't want anybody to be concerned by the fact that some of this stuff, even within this document that we've talked about, might be conflicting at all.
Allison, just a very quick question. I just want to make sure I understand that. Is it your intent or your and Lindsay's intent that we would then do this on our own during those 2 weeks as a homework assignment? Is that what's being suggested?
No, I wasn't suggesting. I mean, there is homework, but Lindsay will explain that in the next steps.
How do we make a list like this for each one?
Wait, Rob, I didn't catch what you said.
Oh, I'm sorry. We've made this wonderful list for the managing the short and long-term success. How are we going to make those lists for each of the other goals?
So you can make them for as many or as few of the other objectives that you would want. I can send you all maybe some prompting questions or some ideas that we've used in creating criteria that might help guide your thinking as you go through these objectives, but asking kind of similar questions that we've done today. What outcomes would we like to evaluate from this objective? And then again, trying to find the scale of very negative to very positive. What would that look like for each objective? But I can provide you all more with some context that might be helpful in developing these out.
Is it your expectation that each one of us on this committee would make a list such as this for each of the goals? Because that does seem like a lot.
That would be a lot. No, that's not my expectation at all. To the extent that you feel that your expertise suits an objective, then it would be great to have your ideas on criteria within that objective.
Okay, I guess what I'm wondering, I don't know quite how to do this procedurally, but I'm wondering of the group that we have here, if there are particular goals that people find particularly interesting. I would love to see if there are people who are interested in maybe taking the full shot at one of these, so that at least we know what you're going to be getting in 2 weeks.
That's a great idea. Allison, if possible, can I share my screen? I'll pull back up that objective slide. And Rob, I think that's a great idea for us to walk through that.
Is this the part where I'm asking for volunteers? I guess, and not
the part of homework assignments. Okay, let's go back to, maybe it's this way too. Okay, put it down. Okay.
I know, as a lawyer, I know enough to know we don't end a meeting without people having assignments, right? And I guess
would it be helpful to take one by one objectives?
Well, what I'm asking by the group, yeah, could we go and then maybe we could just get a sense of people who are particularly interested in one or the other. So at least it's like a potluck. You at least know who's interested in the appetizers and who's interested in the entree and so on.
It's a great idea. So let's take this first group of improving quality of life. Either this category of objectives or one of these three individually. Which members would be interested to work on developing criteria around this?
This is Monique. I would be interested.
Great.
I'll work with you on that, Monique.
Great.
I'm happy to work on, I don't know how many you want on each.
2 to 3 would be a great group. Karen, I'll put you on that one as well. Creating a more equitable society, any individual objectives or the whole group of objectives? Anyone interested?
I can work on that one.
Same here, Karen.
And Karen and Monique, I'd be happy to work with you on that one. And then Lindsay, I know we're not skipping around, but while I'm here, I'd also volunteer for adapting to a changing climate.
I'll put you down for that one.
That's the one I wanted, Faye, for crying out loud.
No way.
Welcome, Mark. Welcome.
You weren't adaptive enough.
Mark, do you play well in the sandbox with others?
Depends on who they are and how big the sandbox is.
I predict you and Faye will be great team on this. And anyone else?
Mark, do you also have interest in conserving natural resources?
Who, me? Let's see. Sure.
So any takers on equity, or we can also move to the short and long-term success in economy.
I would like to do the equity one. This is Takesha.
Okay, great. And on economy, maybe we can skip the short and long term for now. And on this strengthening the economy, who's interested in that?
Hey, this is Erin Spears. I'm happy to work on that one.
Thanks, Erin.
Hey, Lindsay, I'd also go ahead. I'd be happy to work with Erin if no one else signed up for the economy and workforce.
Sounds like time.
This is Tim Hardy. I'll work on that one as well.
Thank you, Tim.
Tyler, maybe too.
Yeah, I would offer to do that as well, but I can do others.
I can do others. I serve on the LCTCS, and we're always dealing with workforce issues. That's why I volunteer for that. But wherever you'd like to be, Tyler.
We can put you both on economy. If that works.
I mean, guys, you can all work with me. It's fine. No need to fight. It's great.
Got it.
Thank you, Erin, for understanding.
Any other takers on natural resources?
This is Susan Floyd. I'm glad to do that one as well as climate.
Thank you.
I'll volunteer for the natural resources and environment as well.
Thanks, Nick.
And this is Tim Hardy. I'll do that one as well, unless you have someone else that would prefer to be on there.
That's great.
This is Courtney Burdette. I'll work on that one unless we already have too many people.
No, you're DEQ. I think you got to do it.
Probably DNR too, but I'm not trying to put the flag out there.
I'm happy to do it as well.
Thank you, everyone. It looks like we have a good list of people down. Anyone interested to continue working on those short and long-term success? Maybe that can be.
Yeah. I would like to continue working on that one.
Okay, Nick, I'll put you down for that.
If I can work with Nick on that, this is Erin. I'd like to as well.
Okay, great. Any other takers? Free reign. Open it up.
I guess put me down on that too. I think that's what I've been kind of talking about. So.
Okay. Brandon, and Brandon, that's on the success one?
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else?
That's great, but I guess in terms, if nobody else will volunteer for any of the objectives, my question just is along the lines of terms of time, of sort of terms of next steps. And if by chance we have ideas to sort of contribute to each of these, should we just plan to maybe send to the person who's leading the write-up on each objective, or is there a way that we can possibly share in a Google Doc or elsewhere?
You can, if you have interest in developing or develop criteria for other objectives that you're not necessarily assigned to, please just feel free to send them my way and I'll make sure it's incorporated with all the others.
Thank you.
And that leads perfectly into our discussion on next steps. So our homework assignment is providing input on your group of objectives in development of this evaluation criteria over the next 2 weeks. So I would ask that by 2 weeks from today, you would send to me individually your list of criteria, or if you've worked with others in developing that criteria also, you can send it as a group, but just to send my way by Tuesday. And I'll send out a reminder to you all alongside just a synthesis of what we worked on today as an example that you can build on. And as a reminder, we'll then take a week after in mid-April to synthesize all of the input we get and then give back to you all a survey that will go out alongside of those hypothetical scenarios in their portfolio form for you all to provide a score for each portfolio as you run it through each objective. So you'll take those portfolios and run them through all the objectives that we talked about, adding those 2 check marks in for the new categories. And again, encouraging you all to provide input in the form of short narratives, knowing that there likely will be questions you can't answer or things that you can't evaluate because it depends on implementation or on the strategies. So that's quite all right, and we encourage those narrative responses. As Allison mentioned, that will even help us further action development moving forward. And I'll let you know when those surveys will be due, but it'll be due about a month after you receive them in mid-April. And again, just to reiterate, I'll add legal to evaluating, creating a more equitable society, and adapting to climate change. So you guys are hitting it all across the board. Here on what you will evaluate in mid-April, and then just to circle back to our meetings that are up and coming, moving forward from today's late March meeting, in mid-April, I'll be reaching out to you all on the April cross-sector workshops. I know I had a slide on this. So as I mentioned, in that all-hands structure that we had in February, instead of one big meeting, we're going to do probably 6 different collaborative working sessions, about 2 hours each, organized around different themes and groups of specific draft actions. So you all and members of all of our other groups will be assigned to one of these working sessions, and they'll be scheduled consecutively so you can watch, and they'll be recorded as well so you can watch them after the fact. But really an opportunity to mix up all of our groups and get some cross-disciplinary review is what we're working towards next. And then again, that late April office hours meeting on any questions you might have on the survey, not a required meeting, but just an opportunity to talk through the survey once you all receive it. And as a last and final reminder, the action development process is going on at the sector committee level right now. And just to encourage you all to consider and submit proposals for specific policies and programs and projects that have cross-cutting implementation priorities. So thinking in climate equity and economic transition, scientific advancement, government finance, you all have such a great cross-disciplinary view and all come from a very different background. So I should encourage you all to partake in the action development, even though you aren't sector committee members. So these are due by April 30th and can be found on our website, and I can recirculate too if that would be helpful. But that I would just tack that onto your homework assignment of developing criteria and your objectives. So with that, that brings us to the end of our content for today. Unless there are any questions, I will stop my screen sharing. And Chairman, if it's all right with you, maybe we can move into our public comment period.
I think that's right.
Okay, great.
Let's move into public.
We are on the Zoom webinar mode, and if there's anyone in our attendee list who's interested in raising a public comment, please just raise your hand and I will unmute you. And while you're doing that, I'll check our climate email, another way that we can receive public comment. We do have a comment at our climate@la.gov email from Michael Tritico, and his comment is on agenda item 7, and his comment reads, back about 15 years ago, some attorneys from New Orleans initiated an action in the World Court contending that the U.S. was exhibiting racism because of the plight of residents in Mossville, Calcasieu Parish, who were being exposed to toxic air pollutants. I was surprised that someone could make such an allegation, since not only Mossville, but other neighborhoods were also subjected to the same pollutants, depending upon which way the wind was blowing. I do not know how that World Court case turned out, but if the World Court even consented to hearing such an odd complaint, it seems reasonable to assume that they would hear some new complaint that the incredible amount of greenhouse gases being emitted from Calcasieu area are a threat to humanity even beyond Louisiana. I do not know who enforces World Court decisions, but the international implications of Louisiana's Department of Environmental Quality and Louisiana's Department of Natural Resources imposing almost no practical constraint on greenhouse gas emissions could leave Louisiana vulnerable to mass claims for damage from people around the world displaced by sea level change or starved by drought or killed by heat waves. Maybe there is time to forestall such litigation. Signed, Michael Tritico. And members, that is the only comment I've received for the legal advisory group so far. I'm giving just a few more seconds. And again, any attendees interested in raising a comment, please just raise your hand and I'll promote you. Seeing no further comments, I will hand it back over to our chair. Close out.
Well, thanks very much. We may actually end this meeting just a few minutes early. But I just want to say a couple of very brief things. One is that I just want to thank members of the committee today for really a nice, robust discussion, a discussion in which we were able to share all kinds of different views. And I think that that's really important that we are able to continue to do that and to talk with one another about the issues that we care so much about. And I want to thank Lindsay and also thank Allison too for being open enough to sort of hear all of our discussion and make changes to some of the work that comes forward out of this, and doing it on the fly and with grace and intelligence when we come at you with so many different angles, I think is something I'm really grateful for. And I also want to point out that I think it's going to be really important for members of our group to think about how we can be integrated and reach out to other advisory groups, for instance, in finding out more about the ideas behind what equitable society should mean for the task force as we go forward, and also think about the different sectors, the different sectoral committees that you are most interested in hearing from or connecting to, because that's going to be a future assignment for each of us, is to become more involved in that process. And I just want to thank you so much for being, for really not hesitating at all and getting involved in doing this homework assignment and getting out these criteria. It's going to make our work so much easier going forward, and it's going to make the product we produce much, much stronger and worthy of public confidence. So thank you very much. Is there a motion to adjourn? All right, Professor Hardy, with the motion to adjourn, is there a second?
This is Takesha, second.
Okay, thank you so much, Takesha. All right. All in favor of adjournment?
I meet forever.
Okay. Okay, and I don't see any votes opposed. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Stay dry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great meeting.